Europe must deliver a strong and united response to Russia's drone incursions at our borders.
Unidentified drone sightings and violations by Russian jets in the skies over European nations have in recent weeks rattled NATO allies. Europe's answer is to build a drone wall.
We need to protect our skies, so the drone wall initiative is timely and necessary.
It's essentially a defence system along the bloc's eastern flank to repel unmanned aircraft from Russia using British-made drones. So would it work? And how close are we to a full-on NATO military confrontation with Russia?
If you have a physical confrontation between Russia and a NATO country or a NATO fighter jet, or if a Russian drone causes a mass casualty event in a NATO country, that's when you get this pressure to respond.
I'm Julie Etchingham, and this is What You Need to Know. Well, I'm joined now by our Europe editor, James Mates. Hello to you, James. You're in Copenhagen, where dozens of European leaders have gathered for a summit with defence against Russia top of the agenda. First of all, what do we know about these drone incursions over the last few weeks?
Yeah, well, it's pretty much a mixed bag between what we know that the Russians have sent and other drone incursions here in Denmark particularly, but elsewhere in Europe as well, that have really put the frighteners on the Danes as to what's going on. And if we're interrupted by sirens here, it is because the security operation around this 2-day of summitry here has been absolutely massive, because they really are on edge. So we've had the incursions across the Polish border and to a lesser extent the Romanian border over the last few weeks, which it is assumed were deliberate, but may not necessarily have been. It is possible that they were aimed at Ukraine and went astray, but the feeling is that this was a test of NATO and of NATO's responses. And of course we've had not just a drone but a manned aircraft, fighter jet incursion into Estonian airspace, which wasn't just someone going off course. This was a 10 to 12 minute long incursion into Estonian airspace, which was very, very serious and obviously deliberate and intended to test NATO and NATO's responses. On the other hand, we've had these drones here in Denmark, which have kept the airport closed on several occasions over the last week. We've had others in Germany and Sweden over critical infrastructure. No one quite knows whose they are or why they're there. Talking to Danish officials here off the record, they say, look, these were carried out by a capable actor. This wasn't some drone hobbyist mucking around. We know that whoever was doing this knew what they were doing. Was it the Russians? Well, they have no direct link. And they also point out in this sort of hybrid attack, much like in some cyber attacks, you can, if you are a hostile actor, hire people, whether that is hackers or drone operators, to act on your behalf, to see what the response is going to be without there being a direct link back to you. So it could easily have been that as well. Either way, I mean, they are very, very nervous about it. All drone flight in Denmark at the moment has been banned while they try and work out who it was and what the potential threat might have been.
And I suppose also, you know, the European countries have got to react whenever these incursions happen, whatever they are actually about. What threat do they actually pose currently, other than being a bit of a sort of troublesome issue and also putting up a great big red flag for the rest of the European nations about how they have to really up the ante in terms of their defence?
I mean, the threat is twofold. One, there's a direct threat, because these drones are very, very dangerous things, as we've seen in the Ukraine war. And the second is the threat that Russia is testing and pushing with a view to doing something else, or with the potential for accidental escalation, which is obviously extremely dangerous in the current atmosphere. But we do know that the damage that drones can do, because we see it almost every single day in the Ukraine war. We've seen the damage that Ukrainian drones have done to Russian military airfields, which you would think will be well guarded, destroying strategic bombers, for example. Now, if the Ukrainians could do that with a drone in Russia, the Russians or another hostile actor could do that to aircraft at airports in Western Europe, or to oil refineries or chemical plants or other bits of critical infrastructure. So absolutely no one is playing down the potential seriousness of this threat, and which is why we're seeing so much talk, particularly this week because of what's been happening in recent days, about the urgent need for Europe to up its defences.
Yes, indeed, and not least from the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen speaking at the start of this week's summit. Let's hear what she's had to say.
I hope that everybody recognizes now that there is a hybrid war, and one day it's Poland, the other day it's Denmark, and next week it will probably be somewhere else that we see sabotage, or we see drones flying, or we see you can there are many different kind of episodes. So I see this from a European perspective. There is only one country that are willing to threat us, and it is Russia, and therefore we need a very strong answer back.
Mette Frederiksen there. Well, she was talking about hybrid war there, and the ex-security boss of the UK, Eliza Manningham-Buller, said this week that Russia may be at hybrid war with the UK. What does that actually mean, James?
Well, it means sort of anything short of a shooting war, really. In information war, we know we've been in for a long time. Interference in elections would certainly come under that category. But then more seriously and more physically, the cyber attacks, where once again, we know that that some at least of the cyber attacks being carried out in the West are Russian-led or Russian-inspired or Russian-financed. And then, of course, you know, mysterious drones, mysterious explosions. There are reports today of Russian nationals being arrested in Poland, carrying explosives and SIM cards and drones. So, I mean, it goes from the, you know, bot farms putting out information designed to interfere with elections or damage democracy in the West, right through to actual physical sabotage attacks, of which there have been some, and everywhere in between. All of which obviously stopping short of a full-on shooting war against NATO. Europe needs to respond to that. NATO needs to respond to that, obviously.
And what action is already being taken, James? We'll talk about the idea of a drone wall in a moment, but what action has already been discussed? What action is already underway in terms of collaborative moves from the European nations? Well,
the first thing to say is that Europe is working out that it has to do this increasingly by itself. That the will or the resources of the United States, while still obviously committed to NATO and to Article 5 defence, they cannot rely on, in the way they would have done in the past, on Washington coming to their aid or leading this effort. And interestingly, from that point of view, they're now not looking so much to America for expertise as to Ukraine, who have been fighting obviously a full-on shooting war as well, but also a massive hybrid war against Russia for the last 3 years. There is no country on earth that knows more about drone warfare and that knows more about the technical responses to drone attacks and to other hybrid attacks on critical infrastructure, attacks on electricity and fuel supplies. No country knows more about that now than Ukraine. So we're in this really interesting reversal where 3 years ago, February 2022, when Russia invaded, Ukraine appealing to the West for its expertise, for its weapons, for its knowledge, for any help it could give, to now, 3 and a bit years later, Western leaders talking to Vladimir Zelensky, who's here today, saying, come on, we need your expertise, we need your help, we need the drone technology you've developed and the anti-drone technology that you've developed. I mean, it's a classic, necessity being the mother of invention situation, and the Ukrainians have leapt miles ahead as a result.
Yeah, it's fascinating that they're now the fount of expertise on this. So let's talk then about this notion of a drone wall. That's the slogan, that's the new word that's suddenly entered our lexicon in the last few days with the discussions between the European leaders. What actually would a drone wall be, and what would it involve?
Well, I have to say, it may not be anything at all, and this word may go out of our lexicon really reasonably quickly. Yesterday was the EU summit here in Copenhagen. Today it's the European political community, and many of the same people. But yesterday at the EU summit, the drone wall idea, which was put forward by Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, as the European response, got a pretty cold reception, particularly from big countries like France and Germany. President Macron was not particularly impressed, nor Friedrich Merz of Germany. So it's not completely clear that it's going to happen. The eastern countries who border Russia are much keener on it. And the real problem is who finances it and who controls it and under whose auspices will it come? Is this a big step towards the European Commission sort of taking on a defence role and leading in a defence role, and or are they? Is it something that countries will do to look out for themselves and coordinate with NATO and with other existing European institutions? And crucially, of course, who's going to pay for it? Is this going to be European Commission money, or are countries expected to pay for it themselves with loans, possibly coming from Europe? So it didn't get a very good reception. Clearly they know that they need better drone defences, and they need a system of drone defences, because when those incursions happened in Poland, the response was not particularly good. Certainly compared to the way Ukrainians shoot down Russian drones, the Polish and NATO hit rate was much worse, and many of those did manage to break through. So very clearly a lot more needs to be done, a lot more technology needs to be deployed, but whether it's going to be a drone wall as conceived by Ursula von der Leyen, it's not looking terribly likely.
And to what degree would the UK be involved in your assessment so far, James? And we heard John Healey, the Defence Secretary, last week talking about UK's ability to really ramp up its drone manufacture. It sounded as though the UK was pretty much leaning into this idea in terms of manufacturing support, if nothing else. What do you think the UK's involvement with this be so far?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. There's been this huge collaboration between the Ukraine and between, actually interesting, Denmark and Ukraine over drone production and drone technology. Other countries obviously involved as well. It would be very surprising indeed if this sort of technological deployment did not involve the UK and UK expertise, not least obviously because we're major players in NATO, and NATO, however much this may be the financing of this may be being discussed at a European Union level, as some other defence spending has been. The deployment of it, the operation of it and everything else will be happening with, in many ways, under NATO auspices, of which obviously we're a full member. So I think both on the fact that we have a lot of existing expertise, a lot of capability, a lot of willingness to get involved and be a part of this, and obviously shared defence concerns. I think, as John Healey said, you would expect significant UK involvement.
Yeah, indeed. It's pretty noisy where you are, James, but we'll battle on. And I suppose really just to round off our conversation on this, I mean, what's your assessment in how Russia might respond? What have we heard from them so far? Could it escalate or de-escalate a situation? It feels that things only ever move in one direction these days.
Well, there's been so much sabre rattling, though, every time that there has been any sort of talk of upping the Western aid or involvement in the Ukraine war. The Russians have threatened Durman-Strang, and the former President Medvedev keeps saying, well, they're heading for nuclear war if they carry on like this. And of course, every time the bluff has been called and it hasn't happened, albeit the world is a much tenser place now than it was before this war started. We're hearing it again from the Russians about a talk of the US will share intelligence on targets in Russia and maybe even provide Tomahawk cruise missiles to the Ukrainians to use against Russia, which President Putin has said will be a major escalation and would involve a Russian escalatory response. So I mean, that's the world we're in every time these things happen. But the most dangerous potential escalation is if Russia carries on testing NATO defences in this way, because if you fire drones at a country, they can land in places that you end up needing to respond to. If you order your aircraft into NATO airspace, the time may well come when one of them gets shot down. And that obviously, that is where escalation, it's not the escalation of words or rhetoric or threats, but if you have a physical confrontation between Russia and a NATO country or a NATO fighter jet, or if a Russian drone causes a mass casualty event in a NATO country. That's when you get this pressure to respond, pressure from publics, pressure from from the military, and that's when you can get on an escalatory ladder without anyone ever really intending to. So the more of this there is around, the greater the potential there always is for escalation to happen, whether or not anyone intends it.
Yeah, perilous times indeed. Thank you very much indeed, James, for taking us through all of that. And that's it for this episode. If you're watching this on YouTube or Spotify or listening on any other podcast platform, hit subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. We'll be back with more quick briefings soon. Bye for now.